The fluorescent lights hummed softly in the nearly vacant courthouse lobby. Judge Alicia Monroe adjusted the strap of her leather briefcase, each step intentional. Today was not just any day. It was sentencing day for a high-profile case. She had reviewed a case that had attracted national attention due to its contentious aspects. As Alicia neared the security checkpoint, she spotted Officer Daniels, an arrogant, broad-shouldered man leaning against the metal detector. His blue uniform was sharp, and his light blue eyes scrutinized her every movement with a disapproving stare. She had encountered Daniels before, each meeting leaving her with a disquieting sense of condescension. But today, something about his demeanor felt even more unsettling. "ID," Daniels commanded, his tone sharp enough to slice through the air. Alicia raised an eyebrow but remained steadfast. "Good morning to you as well, Officer Daniels," she replied, reaching into her bag to produce her government-issued badge. Daniels snatched the badge and examined it as if it were fake. He scoffed. "Judge, huh?" His lips twisted into a smirk. "You don't seem like a judge." The atmosphere grew tense as Alicia's gaze fixed on him. "And what, precisely, does a judge look like, officer?" she inquired, her voice steady yet imbued with undeniable authority. Daniels disregarded her question, his smirk broadening. "Step aside. I need to conduct a secondary check on you." Alicia's expression remained unchanged, but the tension was palpable. The other officers behind Daniels exchanged anxious glances. Daniels, either oblivious or unconcerned, waved impatiently toward a side area. This was not the first time Alicia had faced prejudice, but as she stepped aside, her mind began to strategize. Her years of legal training were already formulating a plan. Something told her this moment would require more than patience. It would demand brilliance. Alicia complied with Daniel's request, moving into the side screening area with her head held high. Her heels clicked against the tiled floor, each sound a reminder of her authority, a stark contrast to how Daniels was treating her. Daniels followed her, standing a bit too close. He crossed his arms, looking down at her with that same condescending smirk. "You know, we get a lot of people who claim to be someone important," he remarked, his tone oozing disdain. "You can't trust everything you see on a badge." Alicia tilted her head slightly, observing him. "And what would you recommend I do to prove myself, Officer Daniels? Wear a robe and carry a gavel at all times?" Daniels chuckled, the sound hollow and patronizing. "Clever, but no, Judge. I think you'll need to answer a few questions." "Questions?" Alicia replied, her voice as steady as a metronome. "On what basis?" Daniels shrugged, his smirk unwavering. "Just procedure. You don't seem like the type who would grasp the seriousness of the law. You're what, early 40s? Got lucky? Pulled a few strings?" The implication was evident. Alicia felt a flicker of irritation, but she kept it in check. She had endured worse. Instead, she allowed a composed smile to appear on her face. "I see. So my years of legal education, my time on the bench, and the rulings I've made in high-stakes cases mean nothing because you've chosen to act as the arbiter of legitimacy today?" Daniels leaned in slightly, lowering his voice. "Listen, lady, I don't make the rules. I just enforce them. Do you want to keep arguing, or do you want to get this over with?" The other officers in the vicinity remained quiet, their eyes darting back and forth between Daniels and Alicia. It was as if they were unsure whether to intervene or let the tension unfold. Alicia reached into her bag again, retrieving her ID, her movements deliberate. "Here's what will happen, Officer Daniels. You're going to scan my badge, verify it, and let me through. Then you can return to your actual job instead of singling me out, for reasons we both know have nothing to do with security." Daniels blinked, momentarily taken aback by her confidence, but the smirk quickly returned. "We'll see about that." He grabbed her badge again, holding it up to the light as if searching for flaws. Alicia remained still, her calm demeanor concealing the fire building within her. Daniels was attempting to assert dominance, to provoke her into losing her composure. But Alicia was no ordinary woman, and Daniels was about to learn that the hard way. Daniels took his time, deliberately prolonging the inspection of Alicia's badge. He flipped it over, squinting at the back as if searching for something incriminating. His performance was a transparent act, an attempt to make her feel diminished under his authority. He mumbled, shaking his head. "Doesn't look official to me. You sure you didn't pick this up online?" Alicia raised an eyebrow, her calm gaze penetrating. Perhaps if you spent more time familiarizing yourself with government credentials and less time antagonizing citizens, you'd recognize an official badge when you see one. A few nearby officers stifled smirks, clearly uncomfortable with Daniels' antics but unwilling to confront him directly. Daniels, however, was not amused. He stepped closer, his tone dropping to a patronizing sneer. "You've got a smart mouth for someone standing in my courthouse," he said. Alicia's eyes narrowed slightly. "Your courthouse? Last I checked, this building belongs to the taxpayers, and I happen to be one of them." Daniel's jaw tightened, and for a moment he looked as if he might snap, but instead, he reached for his radio, clicking it on with exaggerated motions. "I'm gonna need verification on a questionable ID," he announced loudly, his words resonating through the quiet lobby. The tension in the room thickened as the other officers exchanged nervous glances. Alicia, however, remained perfectly composed. She adjusted her posture, standing taller, her commanding presence filling the space. "Questionable ID?" she repeated, her voice calm but cutting. "Officer Daniels, do you genuinely believe this performance is going unnoticed?" Daniels' smirk faltered, but he quickly regained his composure, turning his attention to the radio. "Just following protocol, ma'am. Live." Alicia didn't respond immediately. Instead, she let the silence linger, her gaze fixed on Daniels. The other officers began to shift uneasily, the weight of the moment pressing down on them. Finally, Alicia spoke, her tone as sharp as a scalpel. "If your protocol includes harassing officers of the court, perhaps you should consider reviewing it. Or better yet, I'll review it for you when I'm back on the bench." The subtle but unmistakable threat in her words made Daniel's smirk falter again. For the first time, he seemed to realize that he might have underestimated the woman standing before him. But instead of backing down, he doubled down, leaning closer with an air of false confidence. "You don't intimidate me," he said, his voice low. Alicia's smile widened, but it wasn't one of amusement. It was the smile of someone who had already won a game her opponent didn't even realize they were playing. "Good," she replied. "Because this isn't about intimidation. It's about accountability." Daniels stood rigidly, clinging to his false bravado as he spoke into the radio, relaying the so-called suspicious ID to his colleagues. Alicia stood silently, observing him with an air of quiet authority that only seemed to heighten his frustration. "I'm going to need you to stay right here while I wait for confirmation," Daniels said, gesturing dismissively toward a nearby bench. Alicia glanced at the bench, then back at Daniels. "And what exactly do you suspect me of, officer? I'd like to hear you articulate it clearly for the record." Daniels hesitated for a moment but quickly concealed it with a scoff. "Just routine security." "Routine security?" Alicia echoed, her voice laced with subtle incredulity. "Fascinating. Fascinating, given that you've allowed 3 other individuals to pass through without so much as glancing at their IDs. Daniels stiffened but refused to acknowledge the observation. "I'm just doing my job," he snapped. "And I'm doing mine," Alicia replied smoothly, "though I find it intriguing that your version of routine involves singling out individuals who don't fit your narrow expectations of authority." Daniels flushed slightly, but his arrogance remained intact. "Listen, ma'am, you can keep talking, but it won't change the fact that I call the shots here." Alicia allowed a brief silence to linger in the air, studying Daniels like a seasoned chess player analyzing an opponent's next move. "If you're so confident in your authority, why not escalate this further? Call your supervisor," she suggested, her tone calm but edged with challenge. Daniels hesitated, the confidence in his smirk diminishing for just a moment. The suggestion of involving his superior introduced an element of risk he hadn't anticipated. "Not necessary," he replied quickly. "I've got this under control." Alicia smiled faintly, a glimmer of satisfaction in her eyes. "Oh, I'm sure you do, Officer Daniels, but here's the thing. You've crossed the line from control into abuse of authority, and I'm certain your supervisors will be just as interested in this interaction as I am." Daniels looked like he was about to respond, but Alicia wasn't finished. She reached into her briefcase again, pulling out a small, sleek device. She pressed a button, and a faint beep sounded, followed by a robotic voice. "Recording saved." The other officers froze, their eyes widening. Daniel's face turned pale. "You see," Alicia continued, holding the recording device up, "I've learned to document interactions like these for accountability. Of course, now, why don't we review this recording together and determine whether your behavior today aligns with department policy?" The smug confidence drained from Daniel's face, replaced by a flicker of uncertainty. Alicia could see the gears turning in his mind, the realization dawning that he might have underestimated her. And she wasn't done yet. Daniel's smirk had evaporated entirely, replaced by a tight-lipped expression that barely concealed his unease. The recording device in Alicia's hand seemed to burn like a spotlight, illuminating the cracks in his facade. "Now," Alicia continued, her voice smooth and unwavering, "while we wait for your so-called verification, let's discuss what just transpired. You've detained me without cause, subjected me to unnecessary scrutiny, and implied quite directly, I might add, that I don't look like someone capable of holding the position I occupy. Shall I continue?" Daniels crossed his arms tightly, his eyes darting toward the other officers as though silently commanding their support. None of them moved. The silence stretched heavy and damning. "I told you," Daniels began, his voice defensive. "This is just protocol." "Protocol?" Alicia repeated, her tone almost conversational. "Now then, you won't mind if we ensure your actions align with department protocol, will you? I'd hate for any confusion to arise when this recording is reviewed in detail by internal affairs, or perhaps even the media." Daniel's face turned a shade redder, his jaw tightening visibly. "You're making a big deal out of nothing," he snapped. "Nothing?" Alicia's eyebrows rose, the faintest hint of incredulity breaking through her calm demeanor. "Officer Daniels, let me educate you on what nothing looks like. Nothing is me walking into this courthouse, where I've presided over countless cases, to perform my duties unimpeded, just like every other judge. Nothing is being treated with the same respect afforded to my peers. This, on the other hand," she gestured subtly toward the empty security checkpoint where no one else had been stopped, "is something you will need to account for." Daniels opened his mouth to retort, but Alicia raised a hand, silencing him with a simple, commanding gesture. "But perhaps I'm being unfair," she said, her tone shifting again, now almost clinical. "Perhaps you were simply unaware of my position or my identity. Let me clarify. I am Judge Alicia Monroe, appointed by the governor of this state, confirmed by the Senate, and currently presiding over the most high-profile case in this jurisdiction. I am not here to argue with you. I am here to perform my duties." Daniels took an involuntary step back, his confidence visibly faltering. "I didn't mean—" "No, Officer Daniels," Alicia interrupted sharply, her voice now steely. "You meant exactly what you said. But here's the difference between you and me. I don't need to prove myself to you or to anyone else. Your behavior, however, will need to be justified officially." The tension in the room had reached a breaking point. The other officers, who had remained silent until now, exchanged anxious glances. One of them, an older man with a worn badge that suggested decades of service, stepped forward. "Judge Monroe," he said, his voice careful, "is there something I can assist you with?" Alicia turned her attention to the older officer, her expression softening slightly. "Yes, actually. Could you confirm whether this extended inspection is standard procedure for members of the judiciary entering this courthouse?" The officer hesitated, clearly torn between loyalty to his colleague and the undeniable truth of the situation. "No, ma'am," he admitted finally. "It's not." Daniels shot the older officer a glare, but the damage was done. Alicia's faint smile returned, though it didn't reach her eyes. "I thought as much," she said. "Thank you for clarifying." The air in the room seemed to shift. Daniel's authority, once bolstered by arrogance, now hung by a thread. Alicia watched him carefully, her calm gaze cutting deeper than any words could. The older officer who had spoken stepped back, his expression unreadable, but his silence telling. Daniels, however, wasn't ready to back down. His pride wouldn't allow it. "Look, I don't need to explain myself to you," he said, though his voice wavered slightly. "I was just doing my job." "Oh, I will," Alicia replied smoothly, the edge in her voice undeniable. "But let's not get ahead of ourselves. I want to make sure this protocol of yours is thoroughly documented. After all, You're only doing your job, right? Surely you'd want your superiors to know how dedicated you are to security. Her words dripped with measured sarcasm, each syllable tightening the noose around Daniel's flimsy defense. She took a step forward, her posture exuding confidence. Here's what's going to happen, Alicia continued, her voice low but firm enough to command the room. You're going to hand me back my ID. Then you're going to apologize for wasting my time and making baseless assumptions about my qualifications. Finally, you're going to explain to your supervisor why this situation required escalation, because I'll be filing a formal complaint the moment I leave this room. Daniel's face turned crimson, his smirk long gone, replaced by a strained expression that betrayed his growing panic. That's not necessary, he muttered, his bravado finally crumbling. Oh, but it is, Alicia countered. You see, I'm not just any judge. I'm a judge who believes in accountability. And when people in positions of power abuse their authority, they don't just answer to me, they answer to the law. A murmur rippled through the small crowd of officers now gathered near the security checkpoint. Daniel's colleagues, once silent spectators, were beginning to realize the gravity of the situation. The older officer stepped forward again, this time placing a firm hand on Daniel's shoulder. Daniels, he said quietly, give her the badge back. Daniels hesitated, his hand twitching as though reluctant to let go of the power he thought he held. Finally, with a sharp exhale, he extended Alicia's badge toward her, his movements stiff and reluctant. Here, he said curtly. Alicia accepted the badge, her fingers brushing it with deliberate care. Thank you, she said, her tone neutral but her eyes unyielding. Now, the apology. Daniel's lips tightened into a thin line. He looked as though the words physically hurt him, but under the weight of the moment and the watchful eyes of his colleagues, he relented. I'm sorry, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. Alicia tilted her head slightly. Louder, please. I want everyone here to hear it. Daniel's cheeks flushed deeper, and he clenched his fists at his sides. I'm sorry, he repeated, louder this time. Apology accepted, Alicia said coolly, but this isn't over. Daniel's apology lingered awkwardly in the air, the sting of his humiliation evident in his clenched jaw and stiff posture. Alicia didn't gloat. She didn't need to. The power dynamics had shifted irreversibly, and the room was hers now. Alicia said, slipping her badge into her briefcase with deliberate precision. Let's address the final part of this matter. Your actions today are a glaring example of the very issues we strive to eliminate in public service: bias, discrimination, and abuse of authority. As a judge, I hold officers of the law to the highest standard, and I expect nothing less from you. Daniels opened his mouth to respond, but before he could say anything, the older officer spoke up again, his voice firm. That's enough, Daniels. Step back. Daniels shot him a glare, but the weight of his colleague's authority was undeniable. With a sharp breath, he stepped away, his shoulders rigid with barely contained anger. Alicia turned her attention to the older officer, offering him a small nod of acknowledgement. Thank you for stepping in. I trust you'll ensure this incident is properly documented. Yes, ma'am, the older officer replied, his tone respectful. I'll see to it personally. Good, Alicia said, and I'll be following up to make sure it is. She turned her gaze back to Daniels, who was now visibly trying to avoid eye contact. Officer Daniels, consider this a teachable moment. The next time you feel the urge to question someone's credentials, ask yourself if your actions are rooted in protocol or prejudice, because I assure you, the latter will not go unchecked. Daniels shifted uncomfortably, but he said nothing. His silence spoke volumes. Alicia adjusted the strap of her briefcase and turned toward the security checkpoint, ready to proceed with her day. But just as she stepped through, a familiar voice called out, Judge Monroe! A young court clerk hurried toward her, his expression one of concern. Is everything okay? We heard there was a commotion. Alicia offered him a reassuring smile. Everything's fine now, just a small misunderstanding at security. The clerk nodded but cast a wary glance at Daniels, who was now standing stiffly in the corner, his face a mix of embarrassment and anger. If there's anything I can do— Thank you, Alicia interrupted gently, but I have it under control. As she continued toward the courtroom, her heels clicking confidently against the polished floor, she couldn't help but notice the murmur spreading among the courthouse staff. Word of the incident was traveling fast, and it was clear that Daniel's behavior wouldn't remain a private embarrassment for long. Alicia paused just before the courtroom doors, turning to glance back at Daniels one last time. Their eyes met, and for a brief moment she thought she saw something flicker in his gaze. Shame, perhaps, or the beginnings of self-reflection. But Alicia wasn't here to fix Daniels. She was here to deliver justice, and that was exactly what she intended to do. Alicia entered the courtroom, her presence commanding the respect of everyone inside. The courtroom was filled with reporters, attorneys, and spectators awaiting the high-profile sentencing she was presiding over. She took her seat on the bench, adjusted her robe, and began the proceedings as though the incident at security hadn't just unfolded. But the ripples of her confrontation with Daniels were already spreading beyond the courtroom walls. In the hours that followed, Daniels' behavior became the talk of the courthouse. Staff who had witnessed the incident shared the story, their accounts painting a clear picture of his unprofessionalism and bias. By midday, the head of courthouse security, Captain Morales, called Alicia to her chambers. "Judge Monroe," Morales began, his voice filled with concern, "I want to personally apologize for what happened this morning. Officer Daniels' conduct was unacceptable and does not reflect the standards of this courthouse." "I appreciate that, Captain Morales," Alicia replied, her tone calm but firm. "But an apology isn't enough. This isn't the first time I've encountered bias from someone in his position, and I doubt it will be the last. What I expect is accountability." Morales nodded, his expression resolute. "I understand, Daniels. Daniels has been removed from his post for the time being, pending an internal review. We'll be taking this incident seriously." "Good," Alicia said, leaning forward slightly, "because this isn't just about me. It's about ensuring that every individual who walks through those doors is treated with the dignity and respect they deserve, regardless of their race, gender, or position." Morales assured her that the matter would be handled thoroughly, but Alicia wasn't done. She made it clear that she would be following the review process closely and would not hesitate to escalate the issue if necessary. Later that evening, as Alicia left the courthouse, she noticed a familiar figure lingering near the parking lot. Daniels stood near his squad car, his posture tense and his face set in a conflicted expression. "Judge Monroe!" he called out hesitantly. Alicia paused, her expression unreadable. "Hear his pression." "Yes, Officer Daniels?" For a moment, Daniels seemed to struggle with his words. Finally, he took a deep breath. I wanted to say I'm sorry for earlier. I was out of line." Alicia studied him for a moment, her gaze steady. "You were," she said bluntly. "But an apology is a start. What matters is what you do next." Daniels nodded, looking down at the ground. "I'll do better," he said quietly. "We'll see," Alicia replied, her voice neither forgiving nor harsh. Change isn't about words, Officer Daniels. It's about actions." With that, she walked to her car, leaving Daniels standing alone under the dim parking lot lights. As she drove away, Alicia felt a sense of quiet satisfaction. She knew that systemic change was a long and arduous process, but moments like this, moments where accountability was demanded and justice was pursued, were steps in the right direction. Daniels had learned a hard lesson that day, but Alicia knew her work wasn't done. For every Daniels in the world, there were countless others who needed to be challenged, confronted, and held to account. And Alicia was more than ready to keep fighting, one case, one encounter, and one act of resilience at a time. The end.